I've been reading through the book of Mark lately, and it's a fascinating book. It's short, it's sharp, it's powerful. Some scholars have described it as like the abbreviated version of Matthew, because it cuts out a lot of the sayings of Jesus, kind of just gets to the heart of the message, but communicating thoughts through stories. And I identify well with stories, and maybe that's why I'm really enjoying Mark, is it's got a lot of just stories and stories after one another. And something that I've been doing is starting to analyze a little bit and to think that when Mark is conveying some of these stories, he actually, if you notice, he'll group a few stories together to convey maybe a certain point and a thought. And this came to mind in a very clear way when I was reading through the book of Mark chapter 5, and where Jesus encounters something very unique repeatedly, which seems like very foreign and different stories, but they do have an overlapping meaning and purpose. In Mark chapter 5, we're not going to read through the whole chapter, but I'm going to recount to you that at the start of Mark 5, Jesus encounters some demoniacs, right? Now, what are these demoniacs filled with? They're filled with demons. They're filled with unclean spirits. And yet, Jesus meets these men there in a place, in a Jewish context and mindset, and even in a biblical perspective. This is an unclean place that Jesus is meeting these individuals. These people are unclean, filled with unclean things, surrounded by unclean things. Biblically, they are hanging out and living among tombs where dead bodies are, which are, again, unclean, and surrounded in the hills there closely by unclean swine, pigs. And I think it's interesting that this thought, it just seems to be conveyed over and over in Mark 5, that no matter the mess, no matter the darkness and the hopelessness and the guilt and the shame that one may face, Jesus is not turned off by that in the slightest, but he reaches people exactly where they're at and where they're needed and need Jesus the most. And so this man, this demoniac, he falls down before Jesus. And he's not even able to communicate the burden on his heart, but these demons, they speak out, and there's this interesting dialogue there, and the demons are cast out. And the people in that region, they were happier and more content with living with that uncleanness, with these demons, than they were with having the healed man, because it cost them something. Interesting. Then you go on to the next story in Mark 5, and that's where we're going to spend probably more of our time. But there's a story of a woman with the issue of blood. And then following that, there's the story of this little girl that had died and is resurrected to life. Again, these in a Jewish mindset are situations that if you had come in contact with a demoniac, if you had come in contact with someone that had a condition as such, you'd be counted as unclean. If you had touched a dead corpse, but Jesus is there and he's touching, he's being present, he's there. And rather than Jesus himself becoming contaminated, but he's cleansing. Jesus is healing. Jesus is empowering. And it's beautiful. In Mark 5, and I'm going to start reading there from verse 21, and it says, "Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered around him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet." It's interesting that this prestigious, this ruler, in his most desperate moment, he's not worried about what he's going to look like, what people might think of him, but he's casting all his hope, all his faith in Jesus, and he throws himself before him. It says, and he begged him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live." And Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now, you've heard this, and you understand possibly if you've read this story here before. But this word here where it says that this multitude, and Mark is conveying this thought intentionally because it's going to come up here in a moment, that this crowd is following Jesus, and they are not following social distancing rules, okay? It says that they're thronging around Jesus, actually to the point where it could be almost described as that they're compressed. They're pressed in close to Jesus. There is body contact going on here. It's probably uncomfortable. It's a type of crowd that I would actually be like, whoa, I'll just step away from this. I don't want to be that close. Personal bubble here, right? You don't want to be that close to people. But people are just so drawn. And there's this, it seems to be the wow factor. Like, oh, Jesus is in town. And they're, if it was nowadays, they might be taking out their phones and getting selfies with Jesus because they just want to be close to this man, this star, this thing that they've heard that he does these special miracles, and wow. And there could be people there with genuine needs and desiring, but there seems to be this press, this throng, this compression of people that are hyped out simply because this mysterious and wonderful man is in town. It says in verse 25, now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians, and she spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. I want you to think about that for a moment. There's this woman for 12 years, most likely, no one had ever hugged this woman. No one had ever touched this woman because she's unclean. Now, you can understand in some of the reasons in the Old Testament where God would put these barriers in place that if someone had such an issue, there's some hygienic reasons and purposes. But it conveyed a thought that when people had these types of things happen to them, these types of illnesses and sicknesses, that there was this unconscious negative bias towards these people. These people were viewed as sinners. You can recount the story maybe in John chapter 9 where Jesus encounters a blind man there, and the disciples asked the question, who sinned? Was it this man or was it his parents that he was born blind? That when these types of ailments, these types of uncleanliness, these things, when they happen to people, these people must have done something wrong and they are sinners. Let's stay away. I don't want to catch whatever's going on with them. And so this woman here in Mark 5 would have had these stigmas that she would have been dealing with for the past 12 years. The Bible says here that she had suffered many things by many physicians. And I've read the commentaries about this and that have done the research of what was the common practices for situations like this, and I'll spare you the details. But I can assure you that in all means and purposes of this word, that it says that this woman suffered. She suffered the ointments that she would have had to have taken and ingested, the disgusting flavors, the painful processes that people were trying to cure her of this thing. And never mind that there's this continuous flow of blood that's just draining on her. She's anemic, she's tired, she's fatigued, she's burnt out, and nobody loves her, nobody cares about her, and nobody will ever get close to her. And she's dirt broke now. In verse 27 it says, and when she had heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I'll be made well. It's interesting that Mark here, he's chosen a specific word. That this woman, she says, that I'll be made well. See, in the original text here, the word there in Greek, it means to be healed, which, yes, it means to be made well. but it's the New Testament word that would be used to be saved. So it's interesting that often in these stories, and though we can learn something of it, and we think of often in a spiritual way of how we can apply this to our lives spiritually, but this woman, she exercised the same faith by which we are saved, that she saw, if only I may touch him, I will be saved, or I will be healed. Now, why can't we express the same faith in Jesus now and be healed? I don't know. I don't have that answer. And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But what I do know is that God does promise healing in our lives all the time, every time. And it may be now, it may be in the future, and it may be at the second coming of Jesus. But he does give us the hope and the faith to see us through when that healing will come, when we are faced with ailments and sickness. She expresses faith. She said, if I could just touch him, I'll be saved. I'll be healed. It says, and immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out from him, he turned around in the crowd and said, who touched me? Who touched me? Who touched my clothes? And the disciples said, you see the multitude compacting you, Jesus, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. She spills, right? She just says, this is what happened. And Jesus says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. You know, Jesus, he could have just kept walking. Yet that person was healed. That's kind of an embarrassing thing to talk about. We'll just carry on. But Jesus stops. And he stops intentionally because he wants to remove that concept, that the concept of the mystical, of the mystery, of the magic of it. Yes, don't get me wrong, it was magical in a sense that Jesus healed him through his power that we can't comprehend, that it wasn't through medicine, but it was through divine power that this woman was healed. But he stopped and he wants to draw attention to the situation that people can't simply just bump into Jesus and receive healing or receive salvation. And I wonder, do we teach or do we practice spiritual practices like that? That whether it's just that occasional bumping into spiritual encounters and spiritual moments, that maybe we hope that that's enough, that we might be right with God. But the only way that we can be healed of our sin is by the intentional faith expressed in the one and the only one that can save. So Jesus removes this idea that people just can't get close and just simply bump and be like, oh, well, it may happen, it may won't. But he says, no, it's the one that intentionally says, I believe that you can save me. And thus we can learn this is what happens, and this is how we can experience salvation as this woman was healed from her ailment. Again, thinking about this woman and how she would have been fighting just to get to the very presence of Jesus, and you can almost sense that she's squeezing through this crowd and just touches and nicks his garment. Maybe we're overthinking the analogy a bit much, but there's actually a few stories in scriptures where there's people that are struggling to get close to Jesus, and yet there's a crowd that is preventing them. Actually, I want to think about that on another story. It talks about a throng and about a crowd. It's in the book of Luke, chapter 19. Luke chapter 19, and it's about a little wee man by the name of Zacchaeus. It says in Luke 19 and verse 1, "And Jesus entered and passed through Jericho, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus who was the chief tax collector, and he was rich." Sounds like this man's got it made in the shade. He's rich. He's a wealthy man. He's got nothing to complain about. But he realized that there's something deeper and more. There's a hole in his heart that he has not filled, that the riches could never fill in his life. And it's interesting that lately, some people, very popular people, are getting flack in the media because they've come forward and they said, our life is hard. And all of us poor people are thinking, is it really that hard? Come on. You got your millions of dollars. Is life really that hard? Come on, really? But I tell you what, life is hard whether you have money or you don't have money. And at times, sometimes the emotional struggles and burdens that they carry, they're there in both of those places. And this man, again, maybe through even his own choices of cheating and robbing people, he's a lonely, desperate man. And money's not filling any of that holes in his life. The book Desire of Ages tells us that he had heard about Jesus through the teachings of John the Baptist. And he wanted to make things right with God, and that he even started to make amends, but people weren't willing to believe that he's just taking some sort of sick angle to get close to us, and he's going to rob us again and cheat us in our taxes. And that's hard, to come back from a hard life of crime and people to believe in your confession that it's genuine. But there's a spark of hope in wee Zacchaeus that maybe Jesus might believe him. And it says in Luke 19 and verse 3, it says, "So he sought to see who Jesus was, but he could not because of the crowd, for he was of a short stature. So he ran ahead and he climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. And it says, and when Jesus came to that place, he looked up and he saw him, and he said to him, 'Zacchaeus, make haste, come down, for today I must stay at your house.'" I'm sure we've all heard those stories. I'm sure that, people aren't here today in church because of the church, because of the people in the church, because of the crowds, right? Maybe you have your own personal stories and your own personal grievances. And I tell you what, I think we can do better. We can do better as people of God to have our doors open and our arms open to welcome people. I can do better by God's grace. But I tell you what, the hope that I see in both of these stories of the woman and of Zacchaeus is that they were both longing to Jesus, and it seemed that a crowd was preventing them from reaching that. Is that in both of these cases, Jesus had their eye on them. Jesus saw Zacchaeus before Zacchaeus saw Jesus. So really, it's no excuse to think that, because of the church, I can't come. Because of the people there, I can't come. The heart that is open and that is longing to meet Jesus, Jesus is always there, open and ready to receive them. And I pray that we can do better, and that we will continue to cultivate a spirit of grace, of welcoming, and of open arms to those and whoever might come through our doors here. I often think of a song. It's I'm not going to sing it for you. Don't worry. But it's it's from a band by the name of Casting Crowns, and it conveys an interesting message. It conveys a story about, you might say, a lost individual and the struggles that they might face. So I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to grasp the story. It says, it's called, Does Anybody Hear Her? She is running 100 miles an hour in the wrong direction. She's trying, but the canyon's ever widening in the depths of her cold heart. So she sets out on another misadventure just to find she's another 2 years older and she's 3 more steps behind. Does anybody hear her? Can anybody see? Or does anybody even know that she's going down tonight? In the chorus it says, under the shadows of our steeples, with all the lost and lonely people searching for the hope that's tucked away in you and in me. Does anybody hear? Can anybody see? And it goes on just reflecting on how this person is searching, it's longing, it's hoping for something more. And she feels judgment when she approaches the church. And I tell you what, that historically that may have been a case, and it may be throughout the world, that I can't be good enough to enter those doors. And I'm not talking about necessarily this denomination. That there is this concept that I can't go there, I'm not good enough. And I've talked to many people over and over, and they don't even know you, and you don't even know them, but they've come into our parking lots, and they've parked here, and they're afraid to get out of the car. And praise God, the next week they come back, and God gives them the strength to come in. I just want to share that with you because to realize where people might be at when they walk through those doors. And I pray that they might find your warm handshake, the handshake of Jesus that would welcome them into this place. There's a story by the name, a guy by the name of Tom, and he was a university student in the United States of America. And he had kind of an estranged upbringing. He had found a way to go to university, and he's paying himself through school, but he barely owns the clothes on his own back. He's the kind of guy that had baggy jeans, tattered edges, a dirty old shirt, and long hair. You know, maybe the type of person that you'd be willing to step onto the other side of the street because they might smell a little bit different or they might look a bit scary. And I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about how I might respond to them. And Tom, he felt convicted, man, I need to go to church. I want to get to know what this God thing is all about. Shows up late for church. The seats are packed. It's packed. And what does he do? He opens the door, and he scans around, and everybody kind of makes themselves a little bit bigger. So they don't want them to sit by him. And he walks down the aisle of the church, right up to the front row. Looks around, no seats, and so he sits on the floor. And everybody's thinking, how dare he? Just to sit in a chair, it's not proper. And this faithful old deacon, we love deacons, don't we? He has a cane, and he gets up. Everybody can hear him. He gets up with a groan, and he starts to shuffle down the aisle to the front of the church. And everybody's thinking, it just has to be done. Good on him. I know this is going to be difficult, but it has to be done. And the old deacon walks to the front. And he leans down onto one knee and then 2 knees. And he sits down beside Tom and puts his arm around him. The preacher gets up to preach and he says, I have nothing more that I can say. But the gospel message was conveyed right here. I assure you that I'm not speaking of some bias or some thing that I've seen among this church. I love my church family here. But I'm speaking about maybe the unconscious bias that I experience in and ways that maybe we can open up our own hearts to people that are on the fringes, that are different to us, that might believe differently to us, that might choose different life choices to us. And I pray that by God's grace that we wouldn't be a crowd of people that are thronging Jesus, that maybe we're preventing others from reaching him. I pray that we can be transparent as followers of Jesus, and that people would see the love of Jesus in us and through us. The story of Zacchaeus is powerful because it's not only calls our attention to that very fact, but it calls our attention to be faithful in our business dealings. Because how does Jesus respond to Zacchaeus? He goes to his house, and it says in verse 7, but when he saw it, that all complained, saying, he's gone to be guest with a man who is a sinner. These people are looking down with their lofty glances from their lofty steeples in the church, and they think, how could Jesus be friends with this man? He's a sinner. He's unclean. But Jesus doesn't become unclean when he's with sinners. He cleans sinners. And Zacchaeus, he stood and he said, Lord, look, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I've taken anything falsely or by false accusation, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house because he also is a son of Abraham. And what joy that would have been for Zacchaeus to hear that, to say, yes, I'm a part of the family of God because Jesus said so. The story of Zacchaeus, it calls to our attention that in our daily actions, in our daily business transactions, in our daily way that we conduct ourselves at school and in the park and in the grocery store, that it's a call that we would share the love of Jesus in that space, that we would be open, that we would be honest, that we wouldn't try to do things underhanded or under the table, wrong or illegal, not for just selfish gain, but that we would be there and that it would be clear to whoever that we interact with that Jesus is our guide, that Jesus is our instructor for the way that we are acting in this moment. Zacchaeus reformed, he made things right, and he went away with his burdens lifted. So I pray today that if you're carrying some burden, and if there's one message that maybe we can glean from the scripture today, whether you're like the lost soul, heaven forbid, of the demoniac, the woman that's carrying an issue that she can't seem to shake, or the dead person, or this rich person that is brokenhearted, that whatever our mess might be, Jesus is not repulsed by that, but he's drawn to that. He's willing to heal and to save to the utmost. And I pray that our response might be like Zacchaeus, that we would make things right in our life with the people around us. That we would then respond in the same warmth that Jesus gives us, that we would respond in that way to the people around us. In our fellowship here as believers in Christ, in the way that we interact at the gym and at the work and in those places. And saying that, I'd like to close with singing the song, Take My Life and Let It Be. That our lives, that we would be consecrated to Jesus. And that if there is a burden on your heart today, let's give it to Jesus. Let him heal that. Let him reach into that space and to heal and to forgive. And let's go forward like Zacchaeus. Not carrying the grudges of how people might look down upon us, but going forward because Jesus had welcomed them into the family of God. Let's sing, Take My Life and Let It Be.